Okay. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the very first installment of Turning Point, the webinar and podcast series that is our chance to collectively rediscover and reimagine what New Brunswick looks like on the other side of COVID-19. And we have a very interesting roster of speakers coming to you today to discuss the fiscal realities of New Brunswick. We know that's big on everyone's mind right now. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Matt George, founder of the Unsettled Media Podcast Network, and I'll be your moderator for the duration of this series. Don't forget that we are releasing Turning Point as a recorded webinar if you miss any content today. And we're also releasing it as a very special run of episodes on the Growing Pains with David Campbell podcast, one of our flagship shows. You'll be able to find that on Apple, Spotify, Google, all the places where you find podcasts. Before we recognize our partner organizations, I should say that there is simultaneous translation available for this webinar. You'll find that at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Select French should you need it. That will only be true for this first webinar. The remainder of our webinars will be delivered in English and French separately, and you'll have to register for whichever of those applies to you specifically. Okay, so I do want to recognize our partner organizations, the folks making all of this possible: the New Brunswick Business Council, Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters, Tech Impact, the New Brunswick Multicultural Council, the Chambers of Commerce in Moncton, Fredericton, and St. John, Conseil économique de Nouveau-Brunswick, Atlantic Chamber of Commerce, the Pondish Pondé Center at the University of New Brunswick, and our partners at the Government of New Brunswick and ACOA. And for a full list of our presenting sponsors for this series, head to turningpointnb.ca. You'll also find a great breakdown of all of our speakers for our upcoming sessions. So I do need to set some ground rules here. It's almost summer, but this is a webinar, not a backyard barbecue. So there are some ground rules. We have to do some housekeeping to make sure this is a productive experience for everyone, including you, the audience. And first, so we want you to be involved in this. We want everyone to be involved in the discussion about what comes next. So use the Q&A function within Zoom. We're going to have some curated questions here with all of our speakers. For the questions that we don't get to, we will be bringing those over to the podcast. So hopefully we get to answer a broad spectrum of questions, both on the webinar and on the podcast. If we do have a tech interruption, stay with us. There's always a risk to doing something like this live, but the content is well worth it. We have some very special guests. Stick with us throughout the duration. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to not only envision change and what the future looks like, but also deal with some realities of New Brunswick and find something useful within that. So in that effort, our committee came up with a framework of the 4 noble truths. And for our purposes here today, they look something like this. Number 1 is, what is the pain we're feeling? Number 2 is, what is the cause of that pain? So what can we point to provincially that has led us to our current state of affairs? Number 3, how does that pain get better? What actions can we take now to prevent future pain? And number 4, how do we look confidently to the future? So what does that future state look like? And with that, I have the very happy pleasure of being able to introduce our first speaker. Richard Saillant is a Moncton-based economist and public policy consultant. Richard is a former public sector executive with 20 years of experience in government and academic circles. He's written or directed 4 books, including Over the Cliff, Acting Now to Avoid New Brunswick's Bankruptcy, and A Tale of Two Countries, How the Great Demographic Imbalance is Pulling Canada Apart. He's a great friend of the podcast. Welcome, Richard. The screen is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Matt, and thank you to all for joining in today, and thanks to our special guest, Premier Iggs, who will appear after my presentation. Today, I'll take about 15 minutes to talk about New Brunswick's fiscal situation. It's one way of setting the scene for the broader discussions with this Turning Point series. A series that I hope will make sure that we have the proper tools and the proper strategy for going forward in these trying times. So I will share my screen now to share the presentation. There we are. It shouldn't take long. Okay. So I'll jump right in because I've got quite a bit of material to cover. I'll start with just basic facts about our fiscal situation. The first basic fact is that New Brunswick has very little room left on its credit card to pay for healthcare and other services. As you can see there on the chart on the left, that's our New Brunswick's net debt to GDP. It's been progressing quite fast since the Great Recession, and over recent years, it declined a bit, but we're at around 38%. 10 to 12 years ago, we were doing much better than our sister provinces, Prince Edward Island and Nova Scotia. But this is no longer the case. On the right, you can see that the debt to GDP in New Brunswick is substantially higher, for instance, than Prince Edward Island. But in order to have a more of an apple-to-apple comparison, you would have to include the liabilities of our public utility because Prince Edward
Richard,
Island, yes,
Richard, sorry to pause you. We're getting feedback from the audience that we're unable to see your screen.
okay,
Can you try that again?
okay.
Thank you to the audience for bringing that to our attention.
Is this working now?
Very good.
Okay, I
All yours.
apologize for this. I'll go straight to that chart I was talking about. We were talking about the net debt to GDP, which has been growing in New Brunswick. It's now at around 38%. And I was saying also that in order to compare apples to apples, you'd have to include the liabilities related to NB Power, because regardless of whether we pay for that liability through rates or through taxes, New Brunswick is backing that liability. So when you take into account that factor, you have a debt to GDP ratio that looks more like 60, 62%. So it's considerable. So the next slide is just to show you where our money is going. What I've tried to do there is to give you a sense of what our expenditures were like 20 years ago and what they are now. The first thing I'd like to mention is that although our province is not much bigger than it was 20 years ago, in inflation adjusted terms, we spend 40% more than we did 20 years ago. So total spending is now $9.3 billion in terms of operating spending. If you look at the categories, of course, healthcare has grown fastest by about 2/3, 66%, and it's gone from 30 to 35%. Depending on how you measure it, that number could be a bit different, but 30 to 35%. Education, the share of the pie has stayed pretty much the same, but it's 40% bigger. Other spending were also 3 percentage points bigger than before. The only place where we're spending less is in debt service, believe it or not. Despite the fact that our debt is much higher, we spend a bit less simply because interest rates are much lower. So we get a bit of reprieve there. So this was a bit the background to the discussion. Now we can look at what is going to be shaping our future, in our fiscal future and our quality of life in the years ahead. The first one is going to be healthcare, including elderly care, so that's spending in that area. The other one is obviously our economic growth and our ability to generate revenues to support our spending. And the last one is federal transfers. So I'll start with healthcare, and I'll just essentially provide you with 2 slides to give you a quick sense of the challenge on healthcare. The first point I'd like to make here is that this may sound weird, but we do not fully control our destiny when it comes to healthcare. Actually, what happens in other provinces matters a great deal, and we're going to see this on the next slide. On the left, this is healthcare spending on a real basis per capita over time. The first point that is important to note is that New Brunswick is closely tracking Canada, as you can see there. The other point is that the spending grows in a far from linear fashion. In the 1990s, we had a period of great moderation, with all provinces facing fiscal difficulties and Ottawa cutting back federal transfers substantially by about 23% from 1995, I believe, to 98. Then after that, spending grew quite fast. And then that was the great exuberance of the 2002 first decade of the millennium. And then after that, it slowed down considerably. We're in another era of moderation. What you see there, the blue line is slightly below the red line. So New Brunswick is slightly below Canada. We've been growing our spending slower than the rest of Canada. This despite the fact that we're aging faster. And this is a challenge simply because we should, in order to keep up with Canada, in a sense, we should be spending as much as they are. Now, if this was sustainable, it wouldn't be a problem. But if you look at the chart on the right, what you can see is that there's been rationing in the system. One indicator, for instance, is hip and knee replacement surgeries. In New Brunswick, since 2010, we are up 100 days in terms of the median wait times, whereas in Canada, it's only about 20, 25 days. So we've deteriorated more or less 4 or 5 times faster. So there are signs that there's rationing in the system that is probably related to the fact that we're not investing as much as we were before. The next slide is that however much we've been talking about the pressures induced by healthcare on spending, so far it's been relatively mild. As you can see on the left, spending by age category changes very much with age, obviously, and it's linear for a while and then becomes exponential. Right now, the youngest baby boomer is turning 55 this year, and the oldest baby boomer are turning 74. So as you can see on the curve on the left, we're not there yet when the baby boomers are in the high spending age cohorts. On the right, though, what you can see is that there will be there quite soon. The blue line is those aged 65 to 74. It's not expected to grow that much in the years ahead, simply because baby boomers are already there. But look at the 75 plus, and that's where you see a very fast growth in the number of people aged 75 plus, from around 65,000 today to probably more than 145,000 in 20 years, less than 20 years from now. So we've barely seen the tip of the iceberg, and the process is just getting warmed up. Now, briefly, we can cover one of the other drivers of our ability to sustain our finances, which is economic growth. Here I have good and bad news, and I'm going to start mostly bad news, and I'm going to start with the mostly bad news. The first bad news, in a sense, is that the engines of our economic growth have stalled over the last decade. There are 2 ways to grow the economy. The first one is to have more workers. The second one is to make sure that the value of what the worker produces grows with time. On the left, as you can see, the blue line, the number of workers in New Brunswick has not grown since 2010. In Canada, it has kept growing quite strongly. The other half of the equation is the labor productivity growth, and that's where you can see that in New Brunswick, from 1998 to 2008, we were actually growing faster than Canada. We were producing more value in terms of growth of the value than in Canada. But since then, we've been declining quite rapidly, and in fact, we're now at about 40% of where we were before. So obviously, this has a big implication. The other bad news is that our private sector in New Brunswick over the last decade or so has essentially stalled. So the value of goods and services produced in the private sector over the last decade or so is almost zero in terms of growth, whereas in Canada, it continues to grow. A corollary to that is that employment in the private sector is declined. So from the Great Recession up until now, we've lost about 20,000 jobs. And in terms of public sector jobs, if you look from 2010, that's the red line, up into 2019, we've added around 13,000 jobs or so. So that's not a good mix when your public sector jobs are growing and your private sector, your ability to pay for it is declining. So this is obviously worrisome, and it's not something that can go on forever, at least unless if Ottawa is not there to support us with more money. Last slide on the economy, which are the encouraging signs, is that right before the COVID crisis, we had at least managed to stabilize our labor market. You can see this on the left with the blue line that shows the population of those more likely to work, say 15 to 64, was stabilizing. And the labor force, thanks to a very strong North American economy, notably, we had managed to grow our labor force a bit in recent years. Now, the major driver of this, not reversal of fortune, but at least this change, this stabilization, was migration. Look on the chart on the right, what you can see there, the gray is people leaving the province versus people coming in, interprovincial migration. The dark blue are temporary foreign workers and students, so that's the change in the number of temporary foreign workers and students. And the light blue is net immigration, people coming in versus people leaving the country, coming to New Brunswick. What you can see is that in 2014, migration as a whole was lowering the province's population. Now, fast forward to 2018-19, all groups are now adding to New Brunswick's population. So thanks to migration, we gained about 7,000 people in New Brunswick with strong immigration, with strong interprovincial migration. We had more people coming into the province than leaving, including, by the way, some retirees. And we had a strong net non-permanent resident performance. So that's at least until COVID struck. Now, with immigration grinding to a halt, with the borders effectively closed, we have a bit of a setback. The question is, for how long? I'm going to skip right into federal transfers and try to move as fast as we can. The most important point I'd like to make about federal transfers is that this is our silent partner. Without the federal transfers, New Brunswick has no hope to provide services that are comparable to the rest of Canada, and New Brunswick has no hope to be able to remain a place that is prosperous, that will enable everyone to thrive in New Brunswick. What's happened to federal transfers is that over the last decade or so, for a variety of reasons I can't get into, they haven't grown in real terms. So the red line you see there shows that transfers have not grown in real terms. We have failed to adjust to the slowing federal transfers by spending less, so that we've added around $4 billion to our debt because of transfers slowing down in part. So what we did is, in terms of our own revenues, and that's the blue line, what we did is that we increased taxes. Provincial income taxes early in the decade, and then the PST, our part of the HST in 2016. So in a sense, we're less reliant on the federal government than we were before. We can see that we went from 41% share of federal transfers as a percentage of revenue to down about 35%. But this is, although some people may be proud of this, we're going to need the federal government as a partner as we age if we are to make it in the years ahead. So briefly about the recent trends in federal transfers, a lot of people have been, well, not a lot of people, but I've been talking a lot about the fact that equalization has exploded in recent years. And that's because Ontario is no longer an equalization recipient, which means that we share the pie among recipient provinces. We share a bigger pie. And that is, in my contention, has allowed us to enable factor. But equalization growing in the range of $150 to $200 million per year is not sustainable. We have to expect something more reasonable. Another point with regards to transfers is that the Canada Social Transfer and the Canada Health Transfer that goes to all provinces, not just poorer provinces, is now distributed on a per capita basis, which means, ironically, that poorer, older provinces such as us, we get slower growing payments than richer, younger provinces that whose population is healthier. And a final point I'd like to make about the federal transfer payment is that with Ottawa going into heavy debt to deal with the COVID crisis, I think that this will mean a limited flexibility to transfer more fund to provinces. And there are, in fact, some people who fear slower payment growth or outright cuts. I'm not one of them, but I know that this is certainly not good news at all. So in order to conclude, just 2 slides to conclude here. In terms of rising to the challenge, well, let's remind ourselves what the challenges are. There are many, but one big challenge is going to be healthcare spending. If we spend the way we did over the last 20 years or so, in terms of the spending trends, healthcare spending could be up by around $2 billion by 2030. That's more than a 50% growth. Aging alone would account for about $750 million in annual spending. And I expect that it's going to be hard for us not to emulate other provinces if other provinces start competing for health professionals, simply because there's a shortage of many health professionals and people are going to start competing, and that could exert wage pressures. So we have quite a big mountain ahead of us. And I would like to leave you with 3 questions, if you wish, in terms of challenges and opportunities for dealing with those challenges. The first one would be, how can we flatten the curve of healthcare and other spending through collaboration, technology, and innovation? The second one is, given the uncertain outlook for federal taxes, I haven't spoken about that, but with this heavy debt that the federal government has taken, taxes could be higher, and transfers to provinces, how can we, as New Brunswickers, reignite the private sector and thus grow our revenues? And the last question is, what can we do to return to full employment as fast as possible and resume immigration growth? So that was my presentation. I'll turn it now over to Matt again.
Richard, thank you very much. That's a lot for us to think about. We have a lot of good audience questions coming in as well, and we're going to address that when we get to our dialogue. So thank you very much, and we'll have you back shortly for Q&A.
Thank you.
Okay, our next guest needs no introduction, but here it goes. First elected to the Legislative Assembly on September 27, 2010, Blaine Higgs served as Minister of Finance from 2010 to 2014. He was re-elected in 2014 and again in 2018, representing the riding of Quispamsis, my home riding. In fact, on October 22nd, 2016, he was elected leader of the Progressive Conservative Party of New Brunswick. Mr. Higgs was sworn in as the Premier of New Brunswick on November 9th, 2018. Welcome, Premier Higgs, to Turning Point. We'd love to have your opening remarks and some reflections on Richard's presentation. The screen is yours.
Thank you, Matt, and good morning, everyone. C'est un plaisir pour moi d'être ici avec vous ce matin. No one is kind of more disappointed in where we are right now than I am, certainly through the pandemic situation that's unprecedented. But we put a budget together that I was really proud of, and back in March. We had about a 95 million surplus. We were paying 125 million on the debt. We were actually had held expenses, or we were managing our expenses, no new taxes. In fact, we had introduced a tax reduction that would be on property tax, double taxes, and reducing taxes on businesses. So it was a record budget. It was improved in about 17 minutes, a record time in the legislature. And then within 3 weeks, it was almost irrelevant. And then that's what we're dealing with now in the COVID crisis. Since that time, we've seen a swing in our provincial situation that went from what I just mentioned to a negative roughly 300 million a deficit right now. So this is, we track now like businesses track. We track our expenses weekly, monthly versus budget. That is certainly a new phenomenon in the government world, because it was always done on a projection basis on what's your best outlook for year end and quarterly reviews. So, but we can at any point in time. So when RBC came out with a $1.2 billion deficit, we knew exactly where we were. Now, could it get worse? Well, we're starting to reopen now. So we're optimistic that it won't get worse than what we projected. But how do we manage it going forward? And the challenges that Richard has put forward are ones that he and I have discussed in the past. I mean, certainly his previous books were alarming in the reality that we're facing as a province. But there's a couple fundamental points, and I'm looking forward to getting into the kind of the Q&A session, but that I'd like to make. One of the things that we did differently in getting elected, and people would say you'll never get elected on that, is we didn't promise everything to everyone. We didn't come into this with $1.5 billion of liabilities to get elected. And I haven't participated in that manner while I've been here, and I won't participate in that manner to stay here. So that brings me to the situation right now. So if every new government comes in with let's say $1 billion of new spending, well then you're ramping it up, and how do you pay for that if your economy particularly is flat? You just keep raising taxes. So we didn't start there. That allowed us to balance in the first 3 months. It allowed us to stay balanced and to pay down on the debt. And now we're in a situation now with the COVID. So how do we start back up? What is relevant to businesses as we get back online? So we know, and Richard comments in his points about the federal government and the transfer payments. So I am one who have been communicating this federally in our meetings. I have another one tonight, a national meeting with the Prime Minister and my colleagues across the country. And I've been talking about what state are we going to be in as a country, because we are reliant on transfer payments. I've never been proud of that, but that's the reality we have, and certainly going forward, it could be even more so. but where are we going to be as a country? So I've been reluctant to just say, well, here's more money for everything, and I'll just go into a $500 million deficit because, or higher, because all that's going to come right back around to the people of the province in the coming years. So we've working with companies, like we have the Business Navigator set up. We've got 2,750 companies that have come in, worked with us, and we're working with them. We do have a loan program that's interest free. We did help people to this $900 to who got lost their jobs and were unemployed, and now we're trying to get it back up. So we're working, and we're seeing the results. CFIB reported that 55%, 54% of our companies in our province are fully open, and that's up from May 8th by about 20%. So that's a real good sign. Now, we have had a setback here in the last few days, and that's in region Zone 5 in the Campbellton area. And that's directly related to, what I said yesterday, irresponsible behavior by a medical professional. And who now we're tracking, doing the contact tracing, and it's and the number of cases are expanding. And I'll be doing another press release today on that item with Dr. Russell. But that's most unfortunate. But we knew that we're vulnerable. We knew that that was an opportunity that we were going to have, and that we wouldn't be able to ignore it as long as there wasn't a vaccine present. So we deal with that and we start up, but we need to have, I guess, a clear path on how we ensure our businesses that have long-term viability, that have helped them grow their future. How do we work with them so that our economy starts to improve? We don't go back to where we were, we go back well beyond where we were. That brings me to another point in what I see as a missing link in the system. So democracy, which obviously we value in the many forms, has a way of kind of paying itself to stay elected. So I go back to the original Promise program. But the one thing I missed and have missed ever since I've been involved in politics is the business acumen of how do we manage the system better. So I know that managing the system better isn't the answer to everything, but if an example to this, I'm going to use Newfoundland, because Newfoundland had unprecedented revenues in the oil and gas industry back 10, 15 years ago with the Accord and in the system. But what did they do with that increased revenue? They raised their bar of spending dramatically, and then all of a sudden, when oil prices go out, they lose it. They can't. They're in real trouble, big trouble, because they got hooked on that high revenue stream, and they never controlled the expenses to get there, and now they have a whole new snack bracket that they can't manage. So my point in saying that is simply this: what the democratic system does right now, and how it's used to performing, is that no matter how much revenue bring in, we'll just find a way to spend it. And the questions I get more, political questions, are related to how much money am I spending, rather than how many results am I getting for the money I'm spending. So isn't that ironic? Because every one of you in the business world would be totally focused on the fact that I'm getting results, the money that I'm spending. And that's where I'm trying to get the government. I was in that same track back when I was in finance. We had a bit of hiatus there for 4 years, and now I'm back at it in a different level. But I'm focused on getting results for the money being spent. So anyone comes looking to the government for money, I'm saying, what are we going to get out of that? What's it actually going to do in real terms? Because it's not about a political spend. It's about an actual spend that drives a better economic behavior. ONB has been set up in a whole different way now than it was in the past. I didn't change the name because I didn't care what it was called, but I did care what it did. We have people in there that are analyzing the results. And I had someone, and I'm going to stop with this because I could go on for a long time, but I see Matt's back on the screen here, so that's my cue. He said to me, looking at the operation, this particular applied to ONB, but it applies generally. In Richard's presentation, you can really see information. You can see the trends, you can see the issues, and they're very clearly presented. You would be amazed how many presentations you normally would get in government that don't really lead you to a great conclusion or to a path or a direct outcome. So this gentleman, who's very, very much a business related, said, what my goal is, I'm going to turn PowerPoints into a plan. So when you think about that for a minute, we see a lot of PowerPoints in government, but we don't see a lot of plans that last beyond any one government. Our success, we've seen in the COVID-19 program, have been our four leaders have been working together. We discuss issues together. We have a path going forward, and we haven't been out in the public chirping at each other. That has been a great key to the success of this pandemic. It's shared amongst all people in the province, but it's shared amongst the leaders politically. So why can't we get on 4 or 5 key indicators of performance? And I look at the economy, I look at healthcare, I look at education, I look at our normal spend for service delivery, the results we get for service delivery, things that actually we can say, you know, these don't need to change politically. They just need to ensure that we stay on a program that is 5, 10, 15, 20. It evolves through a continuous improvement model, not through an election process. And that is a huge step change to what we currently do in the democratic process. And I think it's more and more relevant now than it ever was. Is it possible? I think it must be possible because we're being challenged in every province. We're being challenged in free countries in terms of how do they fund the demands that are being placed on our system. I'll stop there.
Mr. Premier, thank you very much for those statements. We got a lot of great questions coming in, so we'll get into the Q&A portion of the webinar. And as we bring back Richard to join the discussion, we have to maybe spend another minute on the elephant in the room here. You mentioned we have had some setbacks in regards to COVID-19 in Zone 5. As we come out of COVID-19, as we look to what comes next, what's at the very top of mind for you right now? And then we'll go to Richard with a response as well. But we'll start with you, Mr. Premier.
Well, certainly it's getting people back to the new way of life with working with COVID until we have a vaccine. So it's getting our economy back up and running. We were focusing on what we've lost in our healthcare system because we had shut down elective surgeries. We know a lot of people, Richard had pointed out on the graphs on the hip and knee surgeries. We actually have a program now to manage surgeries, to get people into the hospitals and have like a rapid response surgery where ORs aren't just 8-10 hours a day. They're actually being used 24 hours. But we focus on getting some of these chronic concerns dealt with in a hurry. But getting the economy up and running, working directly with businesses. I've heard over and over again about WorkSafe is doing a great job with helping businesses to coordinate their activities and to manage under this new reality. And then that gets us back to the as close as we can to the old norm, but that is only stabilizing what we have. Then it's focused on what are the long-term goals that we can agree on collectively. How can I hold a coalition together that will focus on a long-term vision for the province? That's where the concepts, the ideas, the information to hold politicians accountable will help direct future decision-making that is beneficial overall to the province.
Mm-hmm. And Richard, can you expand on that? Can you respond as well?
Well, just to talk about, I would say my biggest concern coming out of this crisis, and obviously talking from an economic perspective, it would be the time that it might take to relaunch fully and recover in terms of immigration flows. My biggest concern is obviously that we have 12,000 people reaching the official retirement age of 65 every year, but only 8,000 New Brunswickers reach the official working age of 15. So obviously we're going to need to make sure that we transition to a new full employment regime, and that may take a while because some people will have to shift industries or shift businesses because once they've been laid off, their jobs, their former jobs might not, exist anymore. So it's going to be a transition, and I'm not saying I have the answer, but this is a discussion we need to have in terms of what we can do to make sure the economy recovers as fast as possible, and that we have an adjustment mechanism. Like right now, we have the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, which was great for perhaps a 4-month period, but beyond that, we need to have a mechanism to help people who are suffering, but also that provides the incentives for economic adjustment. So we need to have that conversation within New Brunswick, but also more broadly within Canada.
Mm-hmm. Richard, you mentioned labor force. Mr. Premier, we saw a recent announcement about temporary foreign workers coming into the province. In terms of economic recovery post-COVID-19, how high on the list of priorities is immigration and our temporary foreign worker portfolio?
Well, beyond the temporary foreign workers to general immigration, we had moved our target on our budget from 7,500 to 10,000, trying to address the overall shortfall we saw, to relate to Richard's comments in our employment in the province, our demographic. So we were looking at, on the temporary foreign worker side, I think what it brought out was a reality. So in the case of making the decision originally to suspend the program, it was let's minimize all risk we have. And with the programs that were being offered by the federal government, we had effectively 70,000 people that were not employed in the province. 40,000 roughly that were on EI or off the job because it wasn't there, and about 30,000 students. So it seemed like, filling most of the jobs in an interim period with people that were in the province would be almost a slam dunk. It would be an easy situation. Well, it turned out not to be easy. It turned out very difficult to get. Now, we've had a reasonable turnout, I guess you'd say, but reasonable out of 70,000, is it? It's like 400 or 500 that have applied and are working on the jobs. But we find those jobs aren't attractive, so they didn't move forward. But I think it has a bigger statement about New Brunswick. We have some great industries here that are stable in the food industry, particularly, and we're relying on temporary foreign workers for temporary that have been coming for 20 years, the same people, because they'll work in this industry. We have a system where people think being on a 1042 program is the way of life. It's it. Richard points out in his graph the productivity. It's real. I mean, how many of the processors said to me, the farmers, other industries said, I need 4, 5, 6 New Brunswick workers to replace one temporary foreign worker. What does that say about us as a society? And I know for a fact, coming from the industry, where I saw those real live productivity differences. And it's like, how do we change that game? So I think looking at the very basis of how our system works, why is there such an incentive not to work in our province? And how do we change that process? And again, I go back to the political side of it. It takes alignment politically. And the alignment politically will come from people that are non-political driving the common sense of it all.
Richard, how important is immigration to our economic recovery coming out of this thing? And maybe as well, very quickly, before we get to audience Q&A, respond to the Premier's comments on our unemployment system.
Well, I'll keep my comments on the unemployment system brief because the whole issue of income support and unemployment insurance is part of a broader discussion that we should have nationally about how do we support people in terms of income support. And right now, EI is used as income support in many places in New Brunswick. But rather than like a lot of people will say that this is unfortunate that we have the 1042 system, but it's also rationality. I'm an economist by training, and unfortunately people respond to incentives. On the immigration issue, which is another place where people respond to incentives, people come here now because there are jobs here, and this is a fun challenge to have. We've never had that in New Brunswick in the past, but there are jobs here, and there will be jobs here. And again, I don't want to refer to my presentation too much, but the engine, historically, right before baby boomers started retiring at the turn of the decade, labor force, the number of people working in the province, accounted for half of our economic growth annually. Now, immigration may not do that kind of miracles, but at least it can stop the bleeding, and it can make sure that businesses who export have the individuals to be able to perform the jobs. Because with aging, a lot of demand is growing locally. So we have to perform services for people who are aging. We have to, haircuts, lawnmowers, all of those things, lawn mowing and all of those things. But that takes new workers, nursing homes, all of that. So people need to fill behind in order to maintain our economic activities and our exports. If that doesn't happen, we have a phenomenon that I believe has already started, which is called deindustrialization. I didn't show this on the chart, but over the last decade, our export businesses, our export sector, depending on how you measure it, has declined in production by about 5 to 6%. Okay, so that is a sign of businesses that are ailing. So we need to reinvigorate the private sector, and immigration is going to be fundamental to that.
And Richard, on that, maybe one last point for you before we head in. You wrote a really interesting piece about the differences in the size of the public sector versus the private sector in New Brunswick, and how that actually insulated us during COVID-19. But does that hurt us on a good day? Do we need to reinvest in the private sector and ensure that we increase the size of our private sector in New Brunswick?
Of course, the fact that we were a bit more sheltered just shows the fact that we are less dynamic economically, and it's not necessarily that the public sector is much bigger in New Brunswick. It's that the private sector is much smaller. So we need to grow the private sector in order to be able to support the public sector. Now, as I said, I did mention grow the private sector. I didn't say that we should necessarily be the ones who invest in the private sector other than typical things that are for government. So this is very much up for debate how to grow the private sector. It's not always, it shouldn't always be with a program worth $150 million for this or that. It can be through a competitive business environment that takes into account our fiscal realities.
Mr. Premier, do you want to respond to that? Does that insulation we had, given the structure of our system, does that prevent us from growing when we come out of COVID-19? Do we need to reinvest in certain sectors here?
Well, I think we need to focus on certain sectors, and I guess springing off of Richard's comment about it isn't a matter of just where does government spend money. It's about providing the right the venue, the right consent, the right conditions for private sector investment. So when we going through this COVID crisis, you know, I'm hopeful the Campbellton thing doesn't get too far in hand, but we've been recognized in the country, you know, and it's brought attention to us as a province, and people have looked at us about, rather than seeing a Globe and Mail article about do everything differently than New Brunswick. It's like, well, what happened to New Brunswick? What's going on there? So it's great to have some wins that people can move off of. I think that, you know, what we did with OMB was try to focus on 3 areas, and immigration was certainly one of them. The private sector investment, what's preventing or what would enhance private sector investment is our tax system. That's why we had the tax break in the system to drop it by, for businesses, it would have meant about 32 million a year over time. But right today, we had to defer that, at least for this year. The exports, I mean, we have a lot of businesses that could expand in exports like we were looking at before, but don't have the capability to do that. So in this startup mode, it's kind of saying, where do we have businesses that really could go much larger, whether they're through technology or innovation, but there's this market out there that's untapped. And how do we help that? And then of course, having the technology with, in terms of having people more aware of what's offered here in New Brunswick. And I do use this example often, and I do it just for one simple reason. And it has to do with the apple growers up in Bouctouche. And this family from India has started and planted, I think, you know, probably like a million acres or something, a million apples. Anyway, they plan to be the largest exporter of Honeycrisp apples by 2025, the largest exporter in Canada. And they started like 4 years ago, and no government money. But what's more ironic is that they actually were told that you can't do that here in New Brunswick. And they have orchards around the world, and they looked at our climate and said, that's a really good spot. They did the soil samples, they did it all. And I've seen some of their apples after like a 2-year growth, and they're huge. So my point is this: sometimes we undersell ourselves. We convince ourselves you can't do that in New Brunswick. And that was a clear case. Even the farmers, the association said, oh, they can't do that here in New Brunswick. Well, I think we can do a whole lot here in New Brunswick, and attitude plays a role. A cultural shift plays a role. And part of the temporary foreign worker ban, first and foremost, it was done to protect ourselves and not have any increased risk. And secondly, to say, can we step up here and really show in a crisis how good we can be? And that was the second kind of option that I was hoping would be much more, I guess, had much more traction than we actually saw. So I am convinced we can move the bar, but we just do things that make sense and people see it and businesses know it.
Yeah, and you're right. You make a good point that telling our story post-COVID-19 is absolutely critical. Richard mentioned federal transfers. Mr. Premier, has the pandemic made collaboration and discussion with Ottawa more difficult, or are those lines of communication more open than ever?
So in my time here, I have never seen more of a national pride, a national interest, a natural collaboration than I've seen in this last 2 months. We hammer away outside but my hammering away outside on issues has been primarily around the funding formulas, the amount of money is being spent, and the results we're achieving. Like the 2,000, I've had more complaints from businesses who received the 2,000 a month, the employees, because they don't want to come back to work. and they can't get people to come back to work. So there's the balance that we're trying to strike. And then the other piece, in related to the funding and the federal programs for capital projects, I say give us flexibility in how we spend that money, because I'm trying to minimize our risk going forward. Like if we need new bridges, we actually need roads, we need repairs or rebuilds to hospitals or to schools. Let me spend that money on things I actually need. Because next year, if I do get hit, or 2 years down the road, and I need the money elsewhere, I still got to fix that stuff if I don't do it now. So there's where we always get into a bit of a disagreement with federal funding, is that they prescribe, I must put it in this area. An example of that in New Brunswick is 162 million of the 550 that we have for federal capital projects is related to transportation and not roads. It would be like a buses or a computer or a subway system or something like this. Well, that doesn't really apply to New Brunswick. And so I wanted to get flexibility in where we put our money so I can minimize our future risk of capital spending needs.
Richard, do you want to very quickly respond to that?
Well, I agree fully with the Premier on the need for flexibility. More broadly, it's normal that in times of crisis that you get provinces in Ottawa working in unity and unison, and Canadians would expect everyone to collaborate like that. I fear, though, that as soon as the crisis recedes and we notice the amount of red ink that is left behind, both in province and provincial capitals and in Ottawa, that this goodwill will unfortunately disappear quite fast, and we'll get into a discussion about how do we have a nursing home strategy nationally while the federal government will have a debt to GDP of 55%. And when other provinces are going to say, we need just as much money, particularly Alberta, as the older provinces, Newfoundland will be bankrupt, and we'll also have a situation where Ottawa, if it wants to invest, might actually have down the road to raise the GST. And that is a problem, and provinces west of the Ottawa River have not recuperated the fiscal room that was vacated by the Harper government 10 years ago, but east of the Ottawa River, we've fully recuperated it. And I think that could be a hook for us to say, well, if you want to raise the HST, let's talk about how you can help provinces that are older and aging faster, so that we have a true national strategy that takes into account the realities of all provinces, and that is not based on some sort of national average that would live where, I don't know, Northern Ontario?
We have some great questions coming in from the audience, guys. We want to get to that right away. Francis asks, what suggestions would you have to enhance cost effectiveness of the public healthcare system, as well as improved health outcomes? And we'll start with you, Mr. Premier, and then go to Richard.
Okay, well, what I have seen in the health system is we have one of the largest expenditures in government that's completely unmanaged. You know, I originally came, when I thought, looking at the Department of Health, I thought they really had an overview of what was happening in each hospital, you know, what were the deficiencies of the operations, how were they scheduled, how we're utilizing our personnel, meaning our surgeons, and how are, in case of surgeries, how are we using our facilities in case of operating rooms. And I found that none of that's the case. It really basically is being managed individually by every hospital. And what brought it to a head when in the COVID crisis was something for me around the masks. So I realized between Vitality and Horizon, it took 2 weeks and maybe longer to figure out what type of mask to wear for employees, and it took 24 signatures of approval. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking, wow, if that's what it takes to approve a mask and the protective equipment, how do we manage to operate the system? And we operate the systems independently. We don't have an overview of best practice, or we actually manage that in a way that this is a facility that really offers the state of the art in this service. So let's not duplicate that. Let's just make that work. Whether it be in the Vitality or Horizon, it doesn't matter. So in healthcare, we have the challenges was pointed out in funding, which initially it started out as a 50-50 funding model with the federal government. That's something that's got a lot of national discussion, that the funding model has been eroded from the federal government over time. And especially now it comes to light because it's needed. But then it becomes down to the actual management of the services being provided. So when we talk about hip and knee, we actually have a target. It was in our budget to set up a hospital that was doing nothing but hip and knee surgeries. And it was just to focus on these wait times. We have tremendous volumes of actual performance standards in each hospital that aren't used for a thing. They're just collect dust on but it's done every year. And it lays right out where opportunities lie. It lays out all the charts on operational operations and the service levels. We just need to manage that system in the healthcare to get better results. But funding will be a continual challenge. There's no question.
Richard, very quickly on healthcare outcomes.
Well, I would say that if you compare New Brunswick to the rest of Canada, New Brunswick doesn't have to be ashamed. It's been doing quite well in terms of health spending in recent years. The concern, though, is with the bigger model. We have a bigger model in Canada, which is publicly funded, publicly delivered, more or less, and it is related to that structure where there are in terms of management, the incentives for efficiency are not always there. So from one end, I find that New Brunswick is not doing that badly compared to other provinces, but maybe at some point we need to have bigger discussions about how do we make sure that we have more financial accountability in healthcare systems.
And we are talking about innovation here, guys. So Eric asks, how do we encourage and how do we navigate challenges in developing an environmentally sustainable and socially responsible economy after COVID-19? Mr. Premier?
So I have believed all along that we are transitioning into a greener economy, but it is a transition period. And it is a transition period that I've always been very concerned that we don't develop it over a period of time. COVID has caused us just to flick the switch. I worked in a refinery for many years, and apparently in the last month, there was actually a free load of crude oil that came through the Panama Canal. Now they had to pay transportation, but imagine negative cost for crude. That was not something imagined when it was built 59 years ago. It would ever be free. But we know the usage is going to decline. We know that fossil fuels are going to decline. And there's a transition to do that in Canada while maintaining our economic viability. We're promoting, let's say, the small nuclear reactors as a non-carbon emitting energy source that is real. And we have some great traction in that area with two technologies, Moltex and ARC. The idea, we're working closely, with food security. That's something that's come out of this whole discussion around that we've talked about food security. But when you look at New Brunswick and you look at what we actually produce here, we're not really in bad shape, but food would be our limitation. But again, getting focused on a long-term vision. I think that what we have seen here is that there's an opportunity for us to focus and transition in a way that allows Canada to be more secure, but it allows North America to be more secure. And I know things are a little erratic south of the border. We hope one day that'll improve. But I have seen a vision here, a longer-term view of what Canada needs to look like. I think the only piece that's missing is how do we actually fund this? Because when Richard mentions, possibly another increase in HST, yeah, there's room out west, but there's really, I don't see more room for taxes in New Brunswick. And I think we have to get off of the tax increase program, and we have to figure out how do we manage better with innovative solutions. We've seen in government changes made in the last month that would have taken years. I'll use the example of moving 200 people out of hospitals into nursing homes, virtual care appointments, which were something that were on the books for a long time. We've developed our own contact tracing app from people within the system. We tore down the department silos, so information was no longer getting locked in one department or another. That's what OMB's doing for businesses, going right through government. So we've seen how good we could be in a crisis. We can't lose that innovation in the long term.
Thank you, Mr. Premier. And we know you have cabinet obligations today, so if you do need to make a quick exit, don't be shy. Please do so.
You saw I was interrupted there, did you?
Yeah. Francis asks, what are Mr. Sayon's and Premier Higgs' thoughts on increasing wages and improving working conditions to tackle recruitment and retention of our labor? Richard, we'll go to you.
Well, actually, average weekly earnings in New Brunswick before the COVID crisis were growing faster than in the rest of Canada. And that was a reflection of the fact that our labor markets are getting tight. And so in a sense, that is part of the problem. When your wages are growing 3 times faster than your labor productivity, if the price is not adjusting, the quantities adjust. And by quantities, it means that people produce less and businesses go out of business. So it would be great to increase, I don't know if you can hear me, but it would be great to increase wages, but it has to be done in a way that reflects our true underlying competitiveness. And if we don't have an agenda for competitiveness in New Brunswick, it's the jobs that we will lose, not just the wages.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And Inda asks, on the Premier's remarks regarding temporary foreign workers, what role does the private sector play to boost productivity in New Brunswick? And Mr. Premier, we'll give you the last word. Let's end on a note of how do we boost productivity in New Brunswick, and what innovation are we looking at coming out of COVID-19?
I think we have to understand why the jobs that are available here are not jobs that we're not proud of and want to be part of. And I know that's the societal thing, I think maybe across the country, but looking at some of the conditions. So when we talk about the wages we're growing, are the wages high enough? But they do have to be tied with productivity. You do have to see that if you're going to earn more money, there has to be a working culture there to support that, because they go hand in hand. And what it's going to force otherwise is we're going to see more automation, and we're going to see less job opportunities for some of these high employed jobs in the province, and that may be a natural reality in any case. But my view is we need a cultural shift here in New Brunswick. We need momentum that's going to be created from this COVID crisis of how good we can be. And I would want to work with businesses that would say, okay, here's where I'm having a challenge. It's either regulatory challenges that don't allow me to expand. It's either the slow response of government that just doesn't relate to a business time frame to react quickly. I've often made the reference of a rapid response government where people to actually get results when they call and get an answer. I think that the people, this may have been a wake-up call for the country, but for New Brunswick. And I'm hoping that we can springboard off of this. And I would love to keep the four of us together in terms of the political side in order to see us keep moving. I fear, as Richard has commented, that things will go back to the way they were, and we'll go in circles in the legislature as often is the case. And it doesn't become about moving the province forward, it becomes about an election strategy. So I'm excited about what we've learned through COVID. I'm excited about bouncing off of that with the people in the government of Brunswick who have proven, our employees have proven how good they can be and how dedicated they can be to get the job done.
Mr. Premier, thank you so much for being here. Richard Saillant, thank you very much for being here. We thank you again, gentlemen. It's going to be an interesting time coming out of COVID-19, and we're grateful for your words. So thank you very much for being a part of this.
Thank you, man.
Thanks.
Everyone else.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us for the first installment of Turning Point. Remember, we are going to dig in on the podcast. We're going to take more questions over there, and Richard will expand in longer form. For security reasons, we ask that you register for each of the following sessions individually, whichever ones you're interested in attending. And next week, we're looking at exploring the important topic of regional collaboration. So how can our communities better come together on population growth, local governance, and economic development? And we'll be joined by the great Herb Emery and Jean-Guy Finn, and that's next Tuesday on June 2nd. So for more information on the speakers, recordings of the webinar, directions on how to get the podcast, go to turningpointnb.ca, and we will see you next week. Thanks for joining us.